cop slaps a boy by mistake. Minutes later, his grandfather, a retired general, appears. It was late summer in New Jersey. One of those humid August afternoons where the air sticks to your skin like sweat-soaked fabric. The city hummed with impatience. The sharp horns, the thudding bass from passing cars, the murmur of people trying to get through another workday. 12-year-old Malik Thomas had no business being out so late. But like many boys his age, he wasn't thinking about danger. He was just thinking about candy. There was a corner store 2 blocks away, and he'd promised his little sister he'd grab her favorite sour gummies before dinner. Malik wore a red hoodie, a size too big, and sneakers that had seen better days. In one hand, he held a crumpled $5 bill. In the other, a phone with a cracked screen. He was whistling low to himself, unaware of what waited just around the corner. A police siren split the air. Suddenly, a black SUV screeched to a halt, and a uniformed cop leapt out. Gun holstered, hand raised, jaw clenched. HEY. On the ground. Now. Malik froze. At first, he thought the officer was yelling at someone else. But the street was empty. It was just him and the man in blue. Now, the officer barked again, and before Malik could form words, the cop was already upon him, but a hand clamped his shoulder. The blow landed. The sound of skin against skin echoed louder than the siren ever could. Malik stumbled back, his $5 bill fluttering to the concrete. His lips split. Tears welled, not just from pain, but from the shock, the fear, the humiliation of it. He wasn't the suspect. He wasn't even close. But the cop didn't realize until it was too late. The real suspect, a tall teenager in a white tank top, darted from behind the alley across the street, dashing past them in full view. The officer blinked, cursed under his breath. Then something changed. His expression went from panic to guilt. But it didn't matter. The damage was done. Malik stood silent, trembling, the candy forgotten, the summer heat now unbearable. And then came the voice, low, calm, authoritative. Officer, step away from my grandson. The officer turned. His mouth opened slightly, like he'd seen a ghost. Out of a black sedan parked just down the block, an older man stepped into view. He wasn't tall, but his presence was commanding. Military-grade posture, silver hair cropped close, a dark green jacket, no medals, no drama, just a quiet kind of danger that needed no announcement. This was retired U.S. Army General Elijah Thomas. And this was his neighborhood. Would you slap a child if you thought you were protecting someone? Would you still feel like a protector after you realized you got it wrong? And what happens when the boy's protector is the kind of man who used to command thousands? Stay with us, because what happens next will change not just one officer's life, but an entire community's. This isn't just about one mistake. It's about how power is used and who's brave enough to challenge it. This is the story of a boy, a slap, and a man who carried honor like a second skin. There are moments in life when everything changes in the blink of an eye. One slap, 1 second, one mistake, and the world splits in half. Welcome to Cracks of Light, a place where stories unfold not just to entertain, but to awaken something deeper. Stories that echo the power of justice, forgiveness, and hidden strength. If you're someone who believes in the weight of truth and the beauty of redemption, hit subscribe. Let's grow this space together. Now, take a deep breath, because what you're about to hear is not just a story. It's a reflection of something we've all felt, a cry for dignity in the face of injustice. The officer stiffened, as if the air around him had turned to ice. He didn't need to ask who the man was. Something about the way Elijah Thomas stood told him everything. His spine straight as a rifle. His eyes locked on the officer like crosshairs. Not aggressive, not loud, just present, dangerously present. Malik looked up, eyes wide, lips still trembling. He didn't understand exactly what was happening yet, but he knew one thing for sure. That voice meant safety. That voice was familiar. And when he saw his grandfather's silhouette step forward, a wave of relief washed over him, so sudden it almost buckled his knees. Elijah didn't rush. He didn't shout. He simply walked until he stood between the officer and the boy. The officer's lips twitched. He glanced around, maybe hoping someone else would intervene, maybe praying this man was bluffing. He wasn't. "Sir, I didn't know." The officer started, voice tight too fast. There was a report. A young male. Dark hoodie. You thought wrong," Elijah interrupted without raising his voice. "And now a 12-year-old has a split lip because you didn't stop to ask a single question." Malik slowly picked up the $5 bill. His hands were shaking. The officer opened his mouth again, but Elijah raised one finger. "Not another word," he said. "Not unless it's to apologize to my grandson." There was a pause. A long, awful pause. The officer's eyes flicked back to Malik. There it was. That small second of recognition. The shift from authority to shame. He took a step closer, awkward. "I'm sorry, son. I made a mistake." Elijah turned his head slightly, just enough to show he was listening but not yet satisfied. The officer continued. "Are you hurt?" Malik didn't answer. Not because he couldn't, but because he didn't want to. His lip hurt, yes, but it was his chest that felt tight. Not from the slap, but from something else. The humiliation, the fear, that sinking sense that even with $5 and a good reason, even with his sister waiting at home, he could still be seen as a threat. Elijah knelt down to Malik's level. His hands were steady, his voice softer now. "You all right, soldier?" Malik nodded. "Barely. We're going home," Elijah said. Then he stood and turned to the officer again. "You will file your own report. You will include every detail. You will identify the boy you struck. You will state the facts clearly, not just for your supervisor, but for your conscience." The officer swallowed. "Yes, sir." "And before you walk away," Elijah added, voice now sharp enough to cut, "you'll remember this. You don't slap a child into compliance. You speak. You observe. And if you're not certain, you don't act. That's not hesitation. That's discipline." He took Malik's hand, turned, and began to walk away. The corner store was no longer a priority. Neither were the gummies. But Malik stayed close, his small fingers wrapped tight around his grandfather's larger ones. "Grandpa," he finally said, voice small, "you didn't have to come." Elijah gave a low chuckle. "That's where you're wrong." They walked down the block in silence for a moment. The sound of traffic had returned. The officer stood where they left him, frozen by the weight of his mistake. Elijah didn't look back. "Let me tell you something, Malik," he said after a few minutes. "When I served overseas, I saw men with weapons and fear in their hearts. You could tell the difference, you know. A man with courage doesn't raise his hand without reason. But a man afraid? He hits first and asks later. Was he afraid of me?" Malik asked. His voice cracked. Elijah stopped, turned, looked his grandson in the eye. "Yes," he said, "but that's not your fault. That's his." Malik blinked, letting those words sink in. "You know what you are, son?" Elijah asked. "You're calm in a storm. You stood there, even when you were scared. You didn't run. You didn't scream. You faced it. That's power. Real power. Is that what you did when you were a general?" Elijah smiled, just a flicker. "That, and a little more." They arrived at Elijah's home, a modest brick townhouse that stood proud in the middle of a block that had seen too many summers and too little care. It wasn't fancy, but it was theirs. Inside, the air smelled of lemon oil and old books. Malik kicked off his shoes slowly, still quiet. Elijah stepped into the kitchen, reached for a first aid kit stored in the same drawer for over 20 years. He returned and knelt in front of Malik again. "Let me see," he said. Gently, with the kind of care that can't be taught in any academy, he dabbed Malik's lip with antiseptic. Malik winced, but didn't pull away. "You okay?" Elijah asked again. This time, Malik nodded with more confidence. "Better." They sat in silence again for a while, the boy on the couch, the man in the armchair across from him. Then Elijah spoke, almost himself. "This world will test you, Malik. It'll try to tell you who you are based on your clothes, your skin, the street you live on. But you're more than that. You're a Thomas. You come from fighters, thinkers, builders. Don't let one man's fear rewrite your story." Malik leaned back, eyes drifting to the ceiling. "Do you think he'll get in trouble?" "I think trouble comes in many forms," Elijah said. "Sometimes it's official. Sometimes it's just the weight of knowing you were wrong." "Will you tell Mom?" Malik asked. Elijah nodded. "She deserves to know. But don't worry. I'll handle it. You've had enough for one day." Then, after a pause, "Tomorrow, You'll come with me to the VA hall. I want you to meet a few people, hear their stories. Understand that being a man isn't about power. It's about responsibility. Malik smiled just a little. Okay. Outside, the sun had begun to set, casting the living room in a warm amber glow. The day had started with a simple errand. It ended with a lesson no school could ever teach. A boy struck by mistake. A grandfather rising in quiet defense. And somewhere in the distance, an officer standing alone on a street, realizing he'd just encountered a different kind of authority. One that didn't come with sirens or steel, but with silence and truth. The night did not fall quietly. It arrived with a heavy silence that clung to the corners of Elijah Thomas's living room, a silence that neither grandfather nor grandson spoke into for the rest of the evening. Malik stayed curled under a blanket, remote in hand, television on, but forgotten. Elijah sat in his chair, his eyes watching the window like he used to watch enemy lines. Outside, the city continued, unaware or uninterested in the storm that had passed through that block just hours earlier. But inside Elijah, something was stirring. A memory, maybe, or a warning. Because what happened today, he knew, was not the end of it. It never was. The next morning came with a sharp knock at the door. Not urgent, but official. Elijah opened it slowly. Two officers stood outside, one in plain clothes, the other uniformed. Behind them, a marked patrol car idled at the curb. The plainclothes man stepped forward, a badge visible at his belt. Mr. Thomas, I'm Detective Sandoval. This is Officer Tran. We'd like a few minutes of your time. Elijah didn't blink. What's this about? An incident yesterday, involving your grandson and one of our patrol officers. Elijah didn't move from the doorway. His voice was calm, measured. Which part? The mistaken identity, the assault, or the apology? Sandoval glanced at his partner, then cleared his throat. We're just trying to get a complete picture. Standard procedure. Elijah gave a short nod. Fine. You've got 10 minutes. Then I have to take my grandson to school. They stepped inside. Malik, still in pajamas, watched from the hallway. Elijah gestured for him to stay back. They sat at the dining table. Sandoval pulled out a notepad. We've reviewed body cam footage. Officer Heller did engage with your grandson. He claims he mistook him for a robbery suspect. Same description, he said. Black hoodie, similar build. But not the same face, Elijah said. Not the same age. Not even the same street. You'll notice the actual suspect ran right past them. That's also on your footage. Sandoval nodded slowly. We're not here to defend his decision, but we are trying to understand what you'd like to see happen next. Elijah leaned forward, his voice low. That depends. Are you asking as lawmen or as people? Sandoval hesitated. Both, I suppose. Elijah studied them for a long moment. Then here's what I want. I want that officer retrained. I want your department to publicly acknowledge that excessive force was used. And I want you to visit my grandson's school. Talk to the students about their rights and about what to do when the system makes a mistake, which it will. Again, Officer Tran shifted uncomfortably. That's a lot to ask for one mistake. Elijah's voice dropped into something colder. It's not one mistake. It's a pattern, and you're not fixing anything until you admit that. Sandoval closed the notebook. We'll do what we can. I can't promise more than that right now. Elijah stood. Then your 10 minutes are up. They left without further protest. Malik stepped into the kitchen. Are they going to arrest him? No, Elijah said. Not today. But justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about planting seeds in people's minds. Seeds that grow into accountability. That night, the phone rang. Elijah answered on the third ring. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, crisp, formal. Mr. Thomas, my name is Lieutenant Karen Wells. I oversee internal affairs for the precinct where Officer Heller works. I'd like to speak with you in person if possible. Elijah agreed. The next day, they met at a neutral location, a coffee shop on the edge of town where uniforms were rarely seen. Karen arrived in civilian clothes, her expression unreadable. We're investigating the incident internally, she began, but I want to speak to you directly because I understand who you are. Elijah raised an eyebrow. Do you? She nodded. Your service record. Distinguished command in multiple overseas campaigns. letters of recognition, community work. Frankly, I'm surprised this hasn't become national news. It's not a spectacle, Elijah replied. It's personal. Karen leaned forward. All the more reason to handle it with respect. I'm not just here for a report. I'm here to ask what you think justice looks like. Elijah looked at her for a long time. Justice, he said, is when my grandson walks the street without being seen as a threat. It's when his skin doesn't make him a suspect. It's when people like Officer Heller take their badge as a responsibility, not a weapon. Karen nodded. I understand. Do you? He asked again. This time, her face softened. I'm trying to. They talked for over an hour. Not just about the incident, but about what it meant. About systems, bias, fear, about what kind of world they wanted to build and what kind of country they had sworn to serve. When they parted, Elijah left with no guarantees. But he left with something else. A sense that maybe, just maybe, someone was listening. But the story did not stop there. Because someone had recorded the slap. A bystander across the street, capturing the moment Officer Heller struck Malik. The footage was posted online 2 days later. It spread quickly. The headline was simple. Cop slaps child. Grandfather responds like a leader. Views climbed. Comments poured in. Anger. Support. Outrage. Reflection. News outlets picked it up. The clip aired on local stations. Then national. Elijah's phone rang constantly. Journalists. Advocates. Old comrades from the military. His name became a symbol. Malik became a symbol. But neither of them had asked for it. And not everyone approved. There were threats. Anonymous messages. Accusations of exaggeration. Of political agendas. But Elijah stood firm. Because the story was no longer just his. It belonged to every boy who had ever been mistaken. Every family who had ever watched authority cross a line. Every person who knew that silence was complicity. And in the midst of it all, Malik went to school. With his head held just a little higher. Because he knew he had not been forgotten. Because his grandfather had stood up, not with fists, but with truth. And because even in the face of injustice, they had found a way to speak. Not to scream, not to burn, but to speak, and to be heard. The days that followed were quiet on the surface, but beneath the calm, something was shifting. The video had changed the rhythm of their lives. Malik still walked to school, but now eyes followed him in the hallway, some wide with curiosity, others narrowed with suspicion. He didn't speak much about it, but Elijah could see it on him like dust that wouldn't brush off. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch, Malik asked the question that had been pressing at him for days. Grandpa, why did you stop being a general? Elijah paused, his hand tightening slightly around the cup of tea he held. A breeze passed through the yard, stirring the dried leaves that had gathered near the gate. I retired, he said simply. It was time, but Malik didn't let it go. He leaned forward, eyes locked onto his grandfather's. But why did you really leave? You don't talk about it. You don't even have your medals out like other vets. Elijah sighed and looked away. There are things, he said slowly, that we carry not as trophies but as burdens. Things we've done, things we've seen. Some things are better left in the past. Malik didn't push further, but the seed had been planted. That night, while Elijah slept in his recliner with the television buzzing low, Malik crept into the study. He had always known the drawer at the bottom of the old filing cabinet was locked, but he also knew where the key was taped under the desk. Carefully, he turned the lock and opened it. Inside were folders. Military grade, organized, meticulous. There were photographs, grainy and aged. Men in desert fatigues. Helicopters. Letters with government headers. One caught his eye. It had his grandfather's name printed in bold, and underneath, a string of commendations. But what stood out most was a small, yellowing photo tucked behind a certificate. It showed Elijah, younger, standing beside a man in a suit. Not just any man. A man with the seal of the White House visible in the background. Malik's breath caught. The paper beneath it was marked confidential. Before he could read more, Elijah's voice cut through the room. What are you doing? Malik jumped, the folder nearly slipping from his hands. I was just curious, he stammered. I'm sorry. Elijah walked in slowly, his eyes not angry but tired. He reached for the folder and closed it gently. Curiosity is a good thing, Malik. But not everything in here is safe to know. Some things carry weight. And once you know them, you can't ever set them down. Malik looked at the photo again. That's the president, isn't it? Elijah hesitated. Yes. It was a long time ago. You worked with the government? I worked with people who made decisions that changed the course of lives. Sometimes for the better. Sometimes not. Then why are you just here? In this neighborhood? In this house? Elijah sat down across from him, the folder still in his lap. Because being powerful doesn't mean you're free. Sometimes it means the opposite. And sometimes, when you've seen what power can do, you choose to live a quiet life to make peace with it. Malik was quiet. Then he asked softly, "Is that why you were so calm with the cop?" Elijah nodded. "I've seen men with more weapons and less fear. Heller isn't a monster. He's just a man who never learned the difference between control and respect. And men like that don't scare me. But what about everyone who doesn't have someone like you to protect them?" Elijah looked down. "That's why this story matters, Malik. Not because it happened to you, but because it keeps happening to others. And maybe this time, someone finally pays attention." The next day, Elijah received a call from an unfamiliar number. A woman's voice, soft but urgent. "General Thomas, I know this is unexpected, but I need to speak with you in person. It's about a case you were involved in nearly 20 years ago." Elijah's body went still. "What case?" She didn't answer directly. "Please," she said, "just meet me. There's more going on than you think." The line went dead. That evening, Elijah sat in the study long after Malik had gone to bed. The folder was open again. His fingers traced the edge of an old photo, one with a name scribbled on the back. David Heller. Younger. Smiling. In uniform. Not the officer from the street. This was someone else. Someone from his past. Someone who had once served under his command. A cold understanding began to form. The Heller who struck Malik wasn't just a rookie with a badge. He was a legacy, a name Elijah hadn't heard in years. And now it was back, tied to this moment, this city, this mistake. He opened a laptop, typed in a name, a few dates, a keyword. The screen loaded slowly, then faster. Files, news articles, buried records. He kept scrolling, and there it was. A sealed investigation, conducted during his final deployment. Allegations. Suppression of evidence. A name blacked out, and the same last name reappearing. Heller. Not the same man. A brother, maybe. A son. Elijah leaned back. The pieces were moving, and if someone had called him about that now, it meant the past wasn't just knocking. It was trying to kick the door in. Outside, the wind began to rise. A storm was coming, not of rain or thunder, but of truth. And Elijah knew this story was no longer about a slap. It was about history repeating itself. A mistake made twice. A debt coming due. And a man who had once turned away from the battlefield, now being called to step back into it. Not with a weapon, but with every ounce of the truth he had tried to bury. Because sometimes the only way to protect the future is to confront the past. The knock came again, but this time it was not the police. It was her, the woman from the call. Mid-40s, sharp eyes, dressed in a simple coat with a badge hidden under her lapel. She introduced herself quietly. "My name is Michelle Rayner. I work in civilian intelligence now, but I used to be military liaison. We worked together once briefly. You may not remember." Elijah studied her face and nodded slowly. "Not many forget that stare," he said. "Come in." Inside, Michelle moved with caution, not from fear, but from respect. She placed a thick envelope on the table and sat down only when he did. "This is about what happened with your grandson," she began, "but it's also about what happened before. Years ago, Afghanistan, Base 7. You remember that operation?" Elijah's face remained still. "Of course I do. We lost 3. One was a civilian contractor. The others were local assets. The report was sealed." Michelle nodded. "It was sealed too fast, General. Too clean. And now, something's circling back. The officer who hit your grandson. David Heller. His father was Major Heller. I believe you remember that name." Elijah closed his eyes for a moment, as if a long-forgotten noise had returned in his ears. "I remember. He was reckless. Aggressive. A liability. I had him reassigned after he violated direct orders and endangered local lives. And then the incident." Michelle leaned forward. "He blamed you. Quietly, but he did. And now, Years later, his son ends up in your neighborhood, wearing a badge, striking your grandson. Elijah opened the envelope. Inside were transcripts, photos, disciplinary reports, all trailing back to the same name. Major Heller. Then his son, David. A line drawn through 2 generations. One held a weapon overseas, the other wears one on American streets. Michelle continued, I think this wasn't random. I think he knew who Malik was. I think your name wasn't just recognized. It was targeted. Elijah sat back slowly. And you're telling me this now because it's about to get worse, aren't you? Michelle didn't flinch. The department is under pressure. They may try to discredit you, paint you as overreaching, a grandfather who made scene. The footage helped you, yes, but there are people in the background who want this to go away quietly. Elijah was silent for a long moment. Then he stood and walked to the window. Outside, Mala played with a ball in the yard. Alone, carefree. For now, I spent my life commanding soldiers, he said, teaching them to hold lines, to hold their nerve. I never thought I'd need those lessons again after retirement. But this is another battlefield. Michelle stood. And the war is truth versus silence. Elijah turned. Then let's fight. She handed him a flash drive. These are files, names, patterns. You'll see the same training notes, the same disciplinary warnings, across different departments, all linked to Heller's influence. And more than that, you'll see where it started, who protected them, who silenced dissent. Elijah nodded. I assume they'll come for me. Maybe not directly, but politically, socially. Michelle replied they might. But if you go public, others will follow. You're not alone. You never were. That night, Elijah didn't sleep. He reviewed every file, every note, every suppressed complaint. There were names of boys like Malik, most not as lucky, some with broken bones, others with records that followed them for life, all from small moments misjudged, misunderstood, or deliberately twisted. He saw the line connecting them, a pattern of authority abused, and behind it a network of silence. In the early morning, he wrote a letter. It was not addressed to the police, not to a court. It was to Malik, my grandson. One day you will read this and wonder why I kept so many secrets, why I stood back for so long. The truth is I was tired of wars, of consequences, of always being the one who stood first. But seeing you that day, your face, your eyes, the way you didn't cry even when you should have, it woke something in me I thought I had buried. You don't deserve silence. You deserve someone who fights not with anger, but with clarity. This fight is mine, but its victory is yours. By dawn, the letter was folded and placed in his safe. The flash drive went into a manila envelope addressed to 3 trusted journalists. One local, one national, one international. The story would not be silenced. And Elijah, once a general, now a grandfather, prepared to stand once more. Not in uniform, not for country, but for truth. Because this was no longer about the past. It was about breaking the cycle and showing his grandson what courage really looked like. The video reached 1 million views within a week, but it was not just the slap that people were watching anymore. It was everything that came after. The calm way Elijah had spoken, the authority in his voice. The moment a retired general had stepped in not to attack, but to correct. It stirred something in people, in teachers who had seen their students punished unfairly, in mothers who had whispered prayers every time their sons left the house, in veterans who remembered Elijah from deployments and were now watching him take command once more. The flash drives arrived at their destinations. The first journalist, a young reporter working for the city's public radio, reached out within hours. She met Elijah at a cafe not far from his home, recorder in hand, but eyes full of caution and respect. What do you want the world to know? She asked. That this is not new, he replied. That behind every headline is a history, and that sometimes the wrong people are allowed to write that history. She published the story within 48 hours. It was titled The General Silence is Over, and it included interviews, documents, and records of prior complaints connected to the Heller name. The report was careful, thorough, powerful, and it sparked something Elijah could not control. Suddenly his porch had visitors, families, activists, former students of the academy where he had once taught part-time after the service. Even strangers who had no connection except for a feeling that they had been waiting for someone to speak first. But not all reactions were supportive. The precinct issued a statement calling the release of sealed documents an ethical concern. They promised an internal review and reminded the public that Officer Heller had been placed on temporary leave. No mention of disciplinary action. No apology to Malik. Just silence wrapped in formal language. Anonymous threats returned. One email warned Elijah to stop playing hero. Another suggested that his medals would not protect him from consequences. He reported them all, but he did not stop. Malik watched everything unfold with wide eyes. At school, he was both a symbol and a target. Some classmates looked at him like a hero. Others, especially those from families with ties to law enforcement, treated him like a traitor. One afternoon, he came home with a torn backpack and refused to say who did it. Elijah knelt in front of him and spoke softly. Being brave is not the same as being safe, but we do it anyway, because the moment we choose fear, we give them what they want. Malik nodded, but that night, he slept closer to his grandfather's room. Meanwhile, Michelle worked quietly behind the scenes, connecting journalists and legal advisors. A retired judge came forward to review the files and agreed to speak publicly. I've seen many cases in my time, she said on a televised panel. But the patterns here are not just concerning. They are deliberate, coordinated, and worse, they've been ignored. The city council called for a public hearing. Community members packed the chamber. Some shouted, others wept, and when Elijah stood to speak, silence fell like snow. He did not read from script. He looked at them one by one. When I wore my uniform, I was told I was a hero. I was thanked at airports, given discounts at diners. But when my grandson was slapped on the street by a man who thought a badge meant he could act without consequence, none of that mattered. And it shouldn't, because no title, no ribbon, no flag gives anyone the right to harm a child and walk away. He paused. The system didn't fail us last week. It failed us years ago. And unless we face it honestly, it will fail again. When he finished, the room erupted. Some cheered, some protested, but no one left unchanged. Officer Heller's name trended for days. Digging began. Old cases reopened. Internal documents leaked. Other officers with similar complaints began to surface. A former cadet came forward, describing a culture of silence and favoritism. Local news ran a special segment titled The Line That Was Crossed. It featured Malik. It featured Elijah. And it ended with a question. How many more? One night, as Elijah and Malik sat quietly watching the latest coverage, the boy asked, "Is it over now?" Elijah looked at him carefully. "No," he said. "It's only just begun." And he was right. Because truth has weight. And once released, it doesn't float away. It lands. It cracks. It shifts the ground beneath our feet. Some stand stronger. Others fall. But it always changes something. In the days that followed, policy reform was drafted. The Academy's training manual was reviewed. A civilian board was appointed to oversee misconduct investigations. Small things, yes, but real. And in a world so often numb to injustice, real change is not small at all. Elijah never returned to silence. He gave talks, mentored young officers, sat in on council meetings, not because he wanted to be a public figure, but because the fight had chosen him again. And this time he was ready, not with weapons, but with words, not with power, but with purpose. The seasons changed. The leaves that once danced in the wind on the day of the slap had long since fallen and been swept away. Winter crept in, quiet and steady, covering the streets with frost and slowing the city's rhythm. But inside the small brick house on the corner, warmth remained. Not just from the heater or the blankets folded neatly on the couch, but from a sense that something had shifted, that the air inside carried a different kind of stillness, one born of purpose and healing. Malik had grown in just a few months. Not in height, though he had stretched a little, but in the way he spoke, the way he listened, the way he held himself. There was a calm in him now, a knowing. His eyes no longer darted when a police cruiser passed. He still noticed, but he did not shrink. He met the world with a little more steel in his spine. One evening, after dinner, Malik placed something on the table in front of Elijah. It was a simple school assignment, a 2-page essay titled My Hero. Elijah adjusted his glasses and began to read. The words were simple, childlike, but honest. They told the story not just of what had happened that day, but of how it had made Malik feel. Angry, afraid, confused, but also proud. Proud to have a grandfather who stood up, who spoke calmly when others shouted, who reminded everyone that power without discipline is just danger in a uniform. Elijah finished the essay in silence. His hand rested gently on the page for a long time. When he finally looked up, Malik asked, "Was it good?" Elijah nodded. "It was better than good. It was true." Malik smiled. "I want to be like you." Elijah shook his head softly. "Don't be like me. Be better. Learn from my silence, but also from my voice. Speak when it matters. Protect others, not because they ask, but because it's right." The next morning, Elijah stood on the porch as Malik headed to school. The boy wore his backpack proudly now, the torn strap replaced, the burden lighter. At the gate, Malik turned and raised a hand. Elijah raised his back. Then the boy disappeared down the sidewalk, swallowed into the rhythm of the city. Elijah stayed outside a moment longer. The wind brushed against his face. He closed his eyes. He remembered the battlefield, the noise, the fear, the weight of responsibility. But now here the battle was quieter, more dangerous in some ways. Less medals, more meaning. Injustice does not always roar, he thought. Sometimes it whispers. And when it does, we must still answer. The story of the slap had traveled far by then. It had become a case study in police academies, a segment in national discussions, a topic in classrooms. But more than that, it had become a reminder that behind every badge, there must be integrity. Behind every mistake, accountability. And behind every child, someone willing to say enough. And now, to you watching, to you listening, to you remembering your own moments of silence or pain or helplessness, remember this. One voice can shift a room. One act of calm resistance can unravel years of silence. One man standing between injustice and a boy can remind the world that dignity still matters. So do not look away. Do not forget. And do not wait for others to fix what is broken. Be the one who speaks. Be the one who stands. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is tell the truth and refuse to sit down. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of something buried or awakened something new, subscribe to this channel. Share the light. Help these stories reach those who need them. This is Cracks of Light, and we're just getting started.